Ethan Carter had never imagined that a quiet, tree-lined suburban street could become the battleground for a war waged over nothing more than porch lights and petty rules. A decorated military veteran and now a respected city official, Ethan had long ago learned that duty sometimes meant standing up for what was right, even if that right meant defying convention. After leaving the armed forces, he settled into a modest home that he treated like a sanctuary, a peaceful retreat where every detail, from the hand-painted shutters to the soft hum of his vintage record player, was a testament to his hard-won freedom. On a crisp early morning, as the sun's first rays filtered through the canopy of oaks, Ethan savored his solitary cup of coffee on the back porch. The gentle buzz of his neighborhood and the distant chatter of early risers formed a soothing backdrop to his quiet routine. His passion for restoring classic cars had not only given him an outlet for creativity, but had also cemented his reputation as a meticulous, no-nonsense individual. Yet, it wasn't just his hobbies or his service that defined him. It was the unyielding commitment to fairness that made him a pillar in the community. Into this calm, however, strode Karen. Self-appointed and self-important, Karen had somehow managed to elevate herself to the role of HOA president, even though many in the neighborhood whispered that her authority was more a product of entitlement than any genuine leadership. With her perfectly coiffed hair, prim outfit, and an ever-present clipboard, Karen believed she was the guardian of community standards. And in her mind, every house, even those not even officially part of the HOA, must bend to her arbitrary rules. That morning, as Ethan admired the warm glow of his carefully chosen porch lights, a combination of vintage bulbs and modern LED efficiency, Karen appeared on his driveway. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of his softly lit entrance. "Mr. Carter," she began, voice clipped and commanding, "I must remind you that even residences adjacent to our community are subject to certain aesthetic standards." Ethan, who had never subscribed to the notion that he was bound by rules he hadn't agreed to, furrowed his brow. "I'm sorry," he replied calmly, "but I'm not even a member of this HOA. My property isn't governed by your bylaws." Her smile faltered for just a moment before morphing into a mask of condescension. "That may be, but as a neighbor and a responsible citizen, you are expected to abide by the spirit of our community guidelines," she insisted, her tone dripping with a sense of self-righteous superiority. To Ethan, it was clear that Karen wasn't interested in dialogue. She was merely enacting a petty power play. Ethan's heart, hardened by years of service and tempered by personal experience, rejected the idea that someone could impose rules without due process. He explained gently that while he respected the community's desire for uniformity, the rules were never meant to extend to properties not governed by the HOA's legal framework. His calm, measured response did little to dissuade Karen. Instead, it seemed only to fan the flames of her indignation. In the background, a few early rising neighbors peered from behind lace curtains, whispering among themselves. Some admired Ethan's principled stance, while others, ensnared by Karen's persuasive rhetoric over the years, frowned disapprovingly at what they perceived as an unnecessary challenge to communal order. Still, to Ethan, it was never about personal preference. It was about principle. The confrontation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Karen, with a dismissive wave of her hand, left behind a lingering aura of entitlement and the unspoken promise that this was merely the opening salvo in a war for neighborhood souls. Ethan watched her go, the remnants of morning light glinting off his beloved car parked in the driveway. He felt a mix of irritation and resolve, knowing deep down that when injustice rears its head, even in the form of an overzealous HOA president, it must be met with reason and determination. Little did he know that this seemingly trivial exchange would soon evolve into a full-blown clash between personal liberty and bureaucratic overreach, a battle where every inch of his property, his rights, and his very sense of self were about to be put on trial. The following morning, a bitter chill clung to the air as Ethan opened his front door, only to be greeted by an envelope sealed with the official stamp of the HOA. The envelope's crisp, impersonal lettering detailed a fine of $750 for excessive brightness. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he read the notice. His porch lights, which he had chosen for their nostalgic glow and energy efficiency, were now being called a violation of some outdated aesthetic guideline. Before he could process his thoughts, there she was, Karen, standing on his front step with arms tightly folded and a look that screamed smug superiority. She stated, "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Carter. There is no exception when it comes to maintaining our community's image." Her tone was icy, each word meticulously measured to convey authority. Ethan, ever the voice of reason, replied, "I respect our neighborhood's desire for uniformity, Karen, but as I mentioned yesterday, I'm not even part of your HOA. This fine is baseless." His tone was calm yet resolute, a subtle reminder of his years of service and personal integrity. But Karen was unyielding. "Regardless of your membership status, your actions are impacting the overall appearance of the community," she countered sharply, sliding a second, even more ominous notice into his hands, a final warning, embossed with the unmistakable authority of the board. Her eyes shone with a thrill of power as she reiterated rules that seemed to have no legal standing. Outside, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered. Some residents exchanged curious glances, while others murmured in support of Karen's unspoken mandate. For many, it was easier to conform than to question the long-held, albeit unofficial, traditions that Karen now seemed determined to enforce by any means necessary. As Ethan carefully examined the documents, he couldn't help but notice a pattern. The language of the notices was vague and threatening, invoking not only the HOA guidelines, but also potential legal action. Karen's next move was as predictable as it was infuriating. Within hours, local inspectors, summoned by the HOA's shadowy network, arrived at his doorstep, clipboards in hand, scrutinizing every aspect of his property for violations. Ethan calmly engaged with the inspectors, pointing out the obvious inconsistencies in the orders he had received. "I appreciate your diligence," he said, "but these notices have no basis in our local zoning laws." His tone was measured, drawing on his experience as a city official. Still, Karen's influence loomed large behind the scenes, and soon the situation began to spiral out of his control. Later that day, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table reviewing a thick file of municipal codes and correspondence with city officials, his phone rang. It was an attorney specializing in municipal law, a courtesy call from a neighbor who had faced similar harassment. Over the phone, Ethan learned that Karen's tactics were not isolated. They were part of a broader pattern of intimidation aimed at forcing even non-members into compliance with arbitrary standards. That evening, as twilight set in over the neighborhood, Ethan felt a growing resolve. He began drafting a formal complaint to the local zoning office, citing the undue pressure and clear overreach by the HOA. The fine, the threats, and the sudden appearance of inspectors, all were signs of an intimidation campaign designed to assert power where none was legally warranted. Karen, however, was not one to take rejection lightly. With a haughty sneer and a promise of further action, she vanished into the dusk, leaving Ethan with a sense of impending conflict. His mind churned with plans not only to clear his name, but to expose the inherent corruption within the HOA's operations, a corruption that reached far beyond a petty fine over porch lights. As the night deepened, Ethan's resolve only hardened. The fine might have been steep, but the true cost was the principle at stake. In a community where one person's autonomy was being sacrificed at the altar of an outdated and arbitrary set of rules, Ethan knew that his fight was only just beginning. His next steps would not only protect his home, but would set a precedent for every citizen tired of being bullied by an overzealous HOA. In the days that followed, the air in the neighborhood grew thick with tension. Whispers and furtive glances replaced friendly hellos as more residents began to notice the increasing influence of Karen and her entourage. While Ethan continued to receive the sporadic fines and warnings, a litany of minor infractions turned into a systematic harassment. He also discovered a pattern that hinted at something far more sinister. Late one evening, while poring over his meticulously organized files of correspondence and municipal regulations, Ethan noticed irregularities in the financial statements of the HOA. Unaccounted for funds, vague memos about community improvements, and inexplicable expenses all pointed to a misuse of power and money. He recalled overhearing hushed conversations among longtime residents, phrases like donations and special funds slipping from lips during casual chats about the HOA's budget. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Ethan set up discreet cameras around his property and recorded interactions at HOA meetings. What he captured wasn't just Karen's theatrical displays of authority. It was clear evidence of a coercive atmosphere. At one such meeting, as the board convened in a cramped community hall, one of the quieter board members, eyes darting nervously, confided in Ethan during a break. Karen's been using the HOA funds to pay for personal expenses. I never thought I'd see the day, but it's all there if you look closely. The revelation hit Ethan like a freight train. Every fine he'd received, every warning pinned to his door, now took on a new significance. These were not isolated acts of overzealous regulation. They were part of a broader scheme to consolidate power and personal profit. Fueled by both righteous indignation and a sense of duty, Ethan began to gather irrefutable proof. He meticulously documented every encounter, from Karen's curt messages and smug proclamations to the dubious paperwork that accompanied each violation. One sweltering afternoon, as he adjusted the angle of a hidden camera near his front porch, Ethan noticed a figure lurking near the perimeter of his property, a person dressed in nondescript attire, clearly attempting to remain inconspicuous. It wasn't long before he realized that Karen's influence extended even to those she hired. A private investigator, sent by Karen to unearth dirt on him, was now prowling the neighborhood. Ethan's heart pounded as he discreetly recorded the suspicious figure, ensuring that every moment was captured in sharp detail. That night, as he reviewed the footage in his study, Ethan's pulse quickened. The investigator was caught red-handed, skirting along the edge of his property, clearly attempting to scope out details for a future ambush. Every piece of evidence added weight to the emerging narrative. Karen was not only abusing her power, but was actively engaged in illegal acts to intimidate those who dared to resist her whims. Fueled by this new evidence, Ethan began to share his findings with a select group of trusted neighbors. Many had grown weary of the constant pressure and arbitrary fines, but fear and apathy had kept them silent. Now bolstered by Ethan's clear and systematic documentation of corruption and extortion, whispers turned into determined murmurs. One by one, residents came forward, recounting similar experiences. Stories of inflated fines, sudden inspections, and mysterious donations extracted under duress. As the grassroots movement began to take shape, Ethan planned his next steps carefully. He compiled every document, every video clip, every overheard conversation into a damning dossier that would eventually force the HOA's hidden hand into the light. His own legal expertise as a city official gave him the confidence to challenge the arbitrary measures being imposed on him and his neighbors. He knew that by uniting the community and exposing Karen's fraudulent practices, he could bring down not just one tyrant, but an entire system built on deception and greed. Late into a sleepless night, surrounded by the hum of his computer and the reassuring clack of the keyboard, Ethan resolved that the days of silent suffering were over. The HOA's tactics had grown bolder and more invasive, but every illegal move only made his resolve stronger. Karen's empire of entitlement was crumbling from within, and soon the rest of the community would awaken to the truth. The stage was set for a showdown, a battle for justice where evidence, law, and the unyielding spirit of the people would prevail over the tyranny of a self-important few. It was an early Saturday morning when Ethan awoke to an alarming sight. Heavy machinery rumbling in his driveway, digging into the asphalt as if preparing the ground for some grandiose public work. The chaos that ensued was unlike anything he'd ever seen in his quiet neighborhood. As he hurried outside, he caught sight of Karen on the sidelines, clipboard in hand, barking orders at a couple of uniformed workers. "We're expanding the sidewalks," she declared with uncharacteristic authority, though no prior meeting had mentioned such drastic measures. Ethan's mind raced. There was no planned sidewalk expansion on record, and certainly nothing that justified the sudden, unannounced work on his property. With the evidence he'd amassed over the past weeks, he knew this was the HOA's latest overreach, a desperate bid to intimidate and control. Without hesitating, he marched toward the commotion. "Stop," he commanded, his voice carrying the firm cadence of someone accustomed to enforcing order. The workers paused, and Karen turned to face him, her expression a mixture of indignation and barely concealed panic. "This is for the greater good of the community," she snapped, her voice rising as she attempted to justify the intrusion. "You must comply, Mr. Carter. Our rules are for everyone's benefit." Ethan's eyes flashed with determination. "Not when those rules are fabricated to bully and extort," he retorted. "I'm not part of an HOA that can dictate what I do with my property, and you have no legal authority to interfere with my driveway." A tense silence fell over the scene. Neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle exchanged looks of disbelief. Ethan, seizing the moment, calmly produced a thick folder filled with legal documents and evidence of the HOA's improprieties. "These," he declared, holding up the dossier, "are proof that your claims are baseless. I suggest you halt all activity immediately." For a fleeting moment, the gathered crowd seemed to lean toward Ethan. One of the workers, unsure and visibly shaken, muttered, "But what if we're breaking a rule?" His uncertainty rippled through the assembly like a wave. Karen, however, was not ready to relent. "We have a mandate," she insisted, her voice trembling ever so slightly as she realized that the tide of public opinion was shifting. "I am doing what's best for the community." Emboldened by the support of his neighbors and armed with incontrovertible evidence, Ethan pressed on. "There is no mandate, Karen. What you're doing is an abuse of power, and I will not stand for it." His words resonated in the hush that followed, each syllable a challenge to the legitimacy of her authority. The HOA meeting that followed later that week became the stage for a public reckoning. In a packed community hall, under the glare of fluorescent lights, and with every eye fixed upon him, Ethan calmly presented his case. He detailed every illegal fine, every bogus inspection, and every fabricated rule that had been imposed upon him and his neighbors. As he displayed photographs of his driveway, partially destroyed by the morning's chaos, the murmurs in the room grew louder. Board members shifted uncomfortably, their earlier allegiance to Karen crumbling in the face of undeniable proof. Karen, desperate to maintain control, tried to interject, her voice wavering as she fired off excuses and denials. But the evidence was overwhelming. One by one, residents rose to share their own experiences of harassment and arbitrary fines. What had started as a personal dispute had become a collective outcry against tyranny. In that charged atmosphere, Ethan's calm authority stood in stark contrast to Karen's frantic defensiveness. "The community deserves better than a self-appointed despot who twists the law to serve her personal agenda," he stated firmly. As he concluded his presentation, the room fell silent and then erupted in applause. The seeds of resistance had taken root, and it was clear that the community was ready to reclaim its voice. Karen's confident facade had finally begun to crack, and as the meeting drew to a close, it was evident that the battle for justice was moving decisively in Ethan's favor. Desperation often brings out the most reckless behavior, and Karen's subsequent actions were a stark testament to that truth. In a final attempt to regain control, she escalated her tactics to a level that bordered on outright illegality. One overcast afternoon, Karen, now visibly disheveled and frantic, dialed the local police station with an accusation that would shock even the most jaded officer. She claimed that Ethan's brightly lit porch constituted a public disturbance, a violation that endangered the safety and tranquility of the neighborhood. When the officers arrived at Ethan's doorstep, their presence was intended to serve as a show of force. However, the situation quickly took an unexpected turn. Ethan, ever the composed professional, calmly produced his official city badge. "I assure you," he explained to the perplexed officers, "my porch lights are neither dangerous nor in violation of any municipal code." His tone was measured and respectful, even as the tension thickened in the cool afternoon air. As the officers exchanged uncertain glances, Karen's plan began to unravel. But she was not one to be defeated so easily. Later that day, in a desperate bid to salvage her crumbling authority, Karen resorted to hiring a private investigator, someone who was rumored to use questionable methods to unearth personal dirt. Under cover of dusk, this investigator began circling Ethan's property, taking furtive notes and snapping photos from hidden angles. Unbeknownst to Karen, Ethan had anticipated such underhanded tactics. With the extensive surveillance network he'd set up in the wake of previous harassment, Ethan caught a clear video of the investigator creeping around his garage. The footage, grainy yet unmistakable, showed the investigator attempting to peer through the side window before hastily retreating. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized that Karen's desperation was spiraling out of control. The following week, at a specially called HOA meeting intended to resolve the mounting issues, Ethan took center stage once again. With the community watching and cameras recording every moment, he unveiled the damning video footage. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen had not only overstepped her bounds, but had actively conspired to invade his privacy. As the video played, a heavy silence fell over the room, punctuated only by the occasional gasp from a stunned resident. Karen attempted to salvage the situation by launching into a tirade of accusations, claiming that the footage was doctored and that Ethan was trying to deflect from his own shortcomings. But the truth was already on full display, and the room's mood had shifted irreversibly. Board members exchanged looks of incredulity and disgust, while many in the audience murmured their support for Ethan. By that point, it was clear that Karen's final, desperate move had only sealed her fate. The officers, who had once been at her beck and call, now appeared disinterested, their attention fully captured by the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. As Ethan calmly concluded his presentation, emphasizing that no citizen should ever be bullied by an overzealous official, Karen's bravado dissolved into a thin veneer of panic. In a final futile attempt to salvage her authority, Karen demanded that the meeting be adjourned so that further investigations could be conducted. However, her plea was met with a resolute silence. The community, now fully aware of the extent of her overreach, had had enough. As the meeting ended in a resounding show of defiance, it became unmistakably clear that Karen's days as the self-appointed enforcer of an outdated HOA were numbered. The fallout from that fateful meeting rippled through the community like wildfire. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself at the center of an unprecedented neighborhood uprising. Homeowners who had long suffered in silence finally found their voice, and the quiet murmur of dissent soon swelled into a chorus of collective outrage. A special meeting was convened, a gathering unlike any the community had seen before. The agenda was simple: to confront the rampant abuses of power that had become synonymous with Karen's leadership. As residents filed into the community hall, there was an air of palpable determination. No longer would they allow one individual's tyranny to dictate the quality of life in their neighborhood. When the meeting commenced, Ethan was invited to speak first. Standing at the front, he recounted the months of harassment, the arbitrary fines, the invasive inspections, the desperate measures taken by Karen to maintain control. He laid out the evidence he had gathered, the meticulously compiled dossier, the damning financial records, and the video footage of the private investigator skulking around his property. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of Karen's credibility. As Ethan spoke, the mood in the room shifted from subdued anger to outright indignation. A vote was taken mid-meeting, and in a stunning display of community solidarity, a majority of the homeowners voted to remove Karen from the HOA board. The decision was not only a repudiation of her tactics, but also a decisive statement that the community would no longer tolerate the abuse of power. News of the vote spread quickly. By the next morning, a local newspaper had picked up the story, and within hours, the city launched an official investigation into the HOA's practices. The once feared institution, which had prided itself on maintaining an impeccable facade, was now under the harsh scrutiny of municipal authorities. Karen's personal address, once a symbol of her power, became a billboard for the community's dissent. Her name was scrawled in angry graffiti on walls and overgrown fences alike. Ethan, though tired from the relentless battle, couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. He sat on his porch, the same one that had been the target of so many of Karen's baseless claims, and sipped his coffee as neighbors passed by, exchanging nods of approval. The sense of vindication was overwhelming. It wasn't merely a personal victory. It was a triumph for every resident who had felt small and powerless under an arbitrary regime. In a final twist of poetic justice, Karen's own home, once meticulously maintained as a shrine to her authority, was put on the market. The very structure that had once served as her fortress of entitlement now stood as a monument to her downfall. Rumors abounded that the city might even dissolve the entire HOA, citing its unconstitutional practices and blatant disregard for individual rights. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. Though he had successfully fought back against the tyranny of a petty official, he knew that the battle for justice was never truly over. Still, in that moment of communal triumph, as the neighborhood united in celebration of their reclaimed autonomy, it was clear that the era of HOA oppression had finally come to an end. As the community's victory reverberated, legal consequences began to catch up with the HOA's misdeeds. In the wake of the public uprising, city officials and legal experts banded together to initiate a series of investigations into the HOA's operations. Complaints that had once been whispered in fear were now being aired in open court. The evidence that Ethan had so painstakingly compiled served as the cornerstone of a class action lawsuit that represented every resident who had suffered under the oppressive rules. Within weeks, the city levied hefty fines on the HOA for enforcing non-existent regulations and for the unlawful seizure of funds. Board members who had once backed Karen found themselves under scrutiny, facing charges that ranged from administrative malfeasance to outright fraud. Even Karen's trusted legal cronies were dragged into the mess, their reputations tarnished as the state bar initiated inquiries into their involvement in the scheme. Ethan played a central role in these legal proceedings. Working closely with a group of determined attorneys and supportive neighbors, he ensured that every document, every piece of evidence, was meticulously submitted to the court. The legal battle was arduous, and at times, the sheer volume of red tape threatened to stall the process. But the momentum of public outrage proved to be an unstoppable force. In a series of public hearings, Ethan took the stand to recount the history of harassment and abuse that had plagued the neighborhood. His testimony, delivered with the clarity of a seasoned official and the passion of someone fighting for justice, struck a chord with everyone in the courtroom. One by one, other residents followed suit, their collective voices building an irrefutable case against the HOA. The court's ruling was swift and decisive. Not only was the HOA fined for its illegal practices, but it was also ordered to cease all enforcement of the arbitrary rules that had long divided the community. The decision was heralded as a landmark victory for citizen rights, a moment when ordinary people triumphed over bureaucratic tyranny. Even as the legal dust settled, the ripple effects of that ruling continued to be felt. Several board members faced additional penalties and were forced to resign from their positions. The HOA structure was dismantled, replaced by a more democratic system in which residents had a real voice. Ethan's final power move wasn't just a personal vindication. It was the catalyst for a complete overhaul of how the neighborhood would be governed moving forward. The legal consequences served as a resounding message. No one was above the law, and the abuse of power, however subtle or overt, would not go unchallenged. With the legal verdict delivered and the HOA's power dismantled, the personal consequences for Karen were swift and severe. Once a figure who had commanded an air of authority, she now found herself isolated and humiliated. The public disgrace that had been meticulously documented in newspapers, on social media, and in local gossip left little room for recovery. Within days of the ruling, Karen was forced to resign from her position. The resignation wasn't a quiet affair. It was broadcast at community meetings and splashed across local news outlets, each retelling serving as a reminder of her fall from grace. Her home, once a symbol of her presumed importance, was abruptly placed on the market. Prospective buyers saw not the home of a powerful HOA president, but the wreckage of a reputation in tatters. As the fallout deepened, personal crises compounded her public humiliation. rumors began to swirl that her husband, long accustomed to her domineering personality, had finally reached his breaking point. In hushed conversations at neighborhood gatherings, people spoke of a messy divorce and of a life that was unraveling faster than she could control. Once, Karen had prided herself on her meticulous appearance and unwavering composure. Now, she was seen arguing frantically at City Hall, desperate to avoid additional fines and public scorn. Every day seemed to bring another blow. A few weeks later, while running a routine errand in a nearby town, she was recognized by a former neighbor. The exchange was terse, an unspoken acknowledgement that her time as the self-proclaimed enforcer was over. Even as she attempted to reinvent herself by accepting a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, the irony was not lost on those who remembered her past misdeeds. One exasperated neighbor even quipped, "I hope you like following the rules this time, Karen." Ethan watched these developments with a quiet satisfaction tempered by a tinge of sadness. While justice had been served, the community's victory came at the cost of witnessing the total collapse of a person who had once wielded power so arrogantly. For Karen, the journey from a high-handed enforcer to a figure of ridicule was complete, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked entitlement. Her personal downfall was not just a legal or professional failure. It was a public stripping away of the persona she had so carefully constructed over the years. The grace and poise that once defined her were replaced by desperation and bitter resignation. In every community meeting, on every street corner, the story of Karen's hubris was recounted as an example of what happens when power is abused. The neighborhood slowly began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. In the weeks and months following the upheaval, a renewed sense of community and trust blossomed where fear and intimidation had once reigned. The battered remnants of the old HOA were swept away, replaced by a collaborative council that prided itself on transparency and fairness. Residents, now emboldened by their shared victory, gathered for block parties and community improvement projects, their laughter and conversation a resounding testament to reclaimed autonomy. Ethan, having emerged as the unlikely champion of justice, found solace in the simple pleasures of everyday life. Sitting on his porch, now a sanctuary free from arbitrary fines and unwarranted scrutiny, he would often watch as neighbors strolled by, exchanging friendly greetings and reminiscing about the tumultuous days that had passed. One afternoon, as the golden light of sunset bathed the street in warmth, a friend strolled over holding a crumpled piece of paper. With a mischievous grin, the friend handed Ethan a freshly printed HOA violation notice, this time for the most absurd reason imaginable. Ethan chuckled, a sound that carried a mix of relief and triumph. "They really tried, didn't they?" he mused aloud, a hint of irony in his tone. The community, gathered around him in a circle of shared victory, erupted in laughter. The absurdity of the notice was a final, symbolic mic drop on a chapter that had threatened to destroy the neighborhood spirit. In that quiet moment, as the camera panned slowly over smiling faces and well-tended lawns, it was clear that the era of HOA tyranny was over. What remained was not just the physical beauty of a reclaimed neighborhood, but the intangible beauty of justice served and unity restored. Ethan's battle had not only saved his own home, it had set a precedent for every community that dared to stand up against overreach. As the screen faded to black, one final message lingered in the air, a reminder that true power lies not in the enforcement of arbitrary rules, but in the courage to stand up for what is right. And in that battle, the quiet hero on the porch had emerged victorious.